welcome to all of you to be here today. This is an event presented by Stevens Leadership Portal, and the Leadership Portal is a new initiative at our school, and our goal is to provide resources and community for all leadership learners and practitioners, especially for issues at the intersections of leadership, technology, and inclusivity. So welcome to our Inclusive Leadership Discussion Panel Series this semester. Today is our first panel, and we'll be focusing on having inclusive conversations. My name is Wei Zheng, Associate Professor of Management, and Richard R. Rosset Chair in Leadership. I'm very honored today to be the moderator and hopefully have a productive and helpful conversation, focusing on inclusive conversation. So let's get started. It's really my great pleasure today to introduce fabulous panelists today. The first one is Lisa Mascolo, and a lot of you are familiar with her probably. She's the trustee of Stevens Institute of Technology and also advisory board member of ARIAD, and former executive at IBM, United Health, Optimos, and Accenture. And welcome, Lisa.
Thanks, Wei.
And second would be Brian Warnson. He's the Vice President of Global Health and Value at Pfizer Oncology. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you. And third one is Michael Salas. He's the Chief Information and Digital Officer of Suez. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Wei. Good day, everyone.
Thank you for making it. I know you were in a business simulation before, and thank you for joining us. And the last one is Jason Thompson. Last but not least, he's the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Western Governors University. He has received Diversity Leaders Award in multiple years by the Profiles in Diversity Journal. And you, Jason, has a new book coming out. Congratulations, which is titled Diversity and Inclusion Matters: Tactics and Tools to Inspire Equity and Game-Changing Performance. So welcome again to all our panelists. I'm pretty sure our audience members are eager to hear your stories and insights. And today, for all of us, please feel free to type in your questions as we go on into the chat box, and we will also have a chance to open the mics and for you to ask questions directly toward the end of our session today. So let's start with this question to get us warmed up. So it now seems like diversity and inclusion is no longer a small groups of people's responsibilities. It is everybody's business. So could we start by talking about what is inclusion in your context? How do we know whether people feel included or not in your context? Lisa, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. For me, inclusion is about the extent to which people feel supported, respected, and ultimately, I think the true test of inclusion is whether somebody feels celebrated, right? The differences that we have, I think, are to be celebrated. And when you're in an environment where the differences are celebrated, I think that's truly an inclusive environment. I think the second part of the question about how do you know if somebody feels included is trickier in complicated situations, and sometimes this topic can be complicated. You can't just say, hey, do you feel included? Because you don't always get the answer. It may make somebody feel uncomfortable. I think the leader's job is to observe and to work to make certain that everybody has a voice, everybody gets to talk, and that when somebody talks, their point of view is respected.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Brian, since your video is next to me, would you like to go next? What does inclusion mean in your context?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what Lisa said there in terms of creating a culture where people feel like they can speak up. I think for me, in my journey on this topic, inclusive has now kind of evolved a little bit to feel like, can people be themselves, or what are they checking at the door when they come into work? And you really want it to be as minimal as possible, right? You want people to be themselves. I know for me, we were, when the pandemic started, we had regular calls, and with the George Floyd murder, the topic came up, and it was very clear that it was bothering people, and so we set up a series of conversations about those types, about racial discrimination, microaggressions, just having. And what became clear to me on my personal journey is, when you work at Pfizer, you have really, really high achievers, smart people that deliver time and time again. And they had to check a lot of stuff at the door, right? And my eyes were really open to that. So as I move forward from an inclusion perspective, it's thinking about that and making sure that people feel like they can be as much of their whole selves, whether that's a racial, gender identity, a parent, whatever, like that they can be as much of themselves that they are outside of work as they are inside of work.
Thank you. Thank you. Michael, would you like to talk about what inclusion means in your context?
Yeah, definitely. And this is coming from, I mentioned this before in the breakout group, this is coming from the Australian working for a French company in the US, right? And, like there is that analogy, right, where, diversity has been invited to the party and inclusion's been asked to dance. But, I'll add a lot more to that. I think inclusion is being able to choose the music, the different types of foods, different cultures and things like that. And to exactly what Lisa said, yes, there will be differences, but celebrating those differences, right? And putting yourself into the other person's shoes in terms of what their upbringing has been and what their value systems are and their beliefs. So I think, to that point, it's around celebrating those differences, right? Whether you have I know at work, one of the best events we have, and look, I run an IT department, right? At work, some of the best things we do is having these multicultural days where we ask everyone just to bring some food from their cultural background, right? And it's one of the best events we have because there is so much conversation, because so many people are willing to learn and understand about, what do Australians eat as opposed to my background, which is Greek. What do Greeks eat, and where's this come from? What's the background and the roots of what you do in terms of the Mediterranean food and things like that. So I think it's exactly what Lisa said around celebrating those differences and being open to understanding those differences.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jason, would you like
Yeah,
to?
I mean, I would probably add a little bit. I always say inclusion means I can disagree. It doesn't mean I can be disagreeable, right? Like nobody wants that person, but we want somebody who can speak up and say, I disagree with what's being said. And what I found is, especially in my consulting work, is when questions are asked and you hear a lot of silence, something's wrong. You don't have inclusion. It's a simple measure because people have learned that we don't speak up here. And that silence is how they voice it, that I've learned that's how I'll be punished. And Michael made a good point. I love the analogy about, being asked to dance. And I always say equity is being able to say, I don't want to dance with you and not having to suffer that kind of retribution. And we all know when we're in that environment where I have to dance with you. And to me, when you have full inclusion, you have equity. That is the measure of whether or not it's working, is that I can say, no, I don't want to do that. And I won't be punished, that I know that I will still get my next promotion. I'll still be valued as an employee here when I can disagree. And I think that's the piece that many times is easy to actually assess, but most people don't want to have that conversation around. And I know that's part of our conversation today, is that silence is telling you something. When you're in a room and you ask questions and no one responds, there's no inclusion, and everyone's learned the message that there's retribution in this environment. So that's usually what I tell people. Silence is not a good thing.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for the insight. So it's really interesting. We talked about feeling celebrated and people speaking up rather than keeping silence and be themselves and be authentic. So those are really things that all of us want. But sometimes conversations about diversity can be really uncomfortable, especially like what you mentioned, Brian. There could be racial injustice, inequities, and all sorts of inequalities across the organization or in society and reflected in organizations. And when we have conversations about that are uncomfortable, how do you deal with them? What good conversations look like? Not probably some conversations are always emotion laden, but what good conversations look like? What bad conversations look like? Jason, would you like to go this time first?
Sure. I think I always tell people, get uncomfortable and you will be uncomfortable. Like that's the reality. And so we have stopped moving towards trying to make people comfortable and say, that's how you learn. If you think about it, first day of calculus, pretty uncomfortable because I don't know calculus. Race, politics, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, these things make us uncomfortable. And if you think about it, there's always that, like when you go to a party, you don't talk about politics and race, right? We know this. So by definition, we've already taught you from before they even have the conversation, you're not supposed to have it. So that's why you're uncomfortable. We also teach you, if something makes you uncomfortable, move away from it. So we've already, culturally in the US, we teach you not to do the very things we need you to do. And so what we have done is say, no, actually, you're going to be uncomfortable, get used to it. It doesn't mean you've done anything wrong, but that's going to be part of the process. And that this desire to be comfortable many times and our desire to make you comfortable prevents us from having the conversation that we need to have. And so we have just taken the position that you're going to be uncomfortable, get used to it. That's how this works. And there's nothing wrong with being uncomfortable. And we've done another thing that we try to decouple being uncomfortable from safety. Like a lot of times we'll say, oh, you need to have a safe place. And talking about race is not unsafe. Talking about people who are from the LGBTQ community are not unsafe. So if you keep creating this paradigm as safety, and there's only certain places where you can have this conversation so you can be safe, you are also messaging that these people are unsafe, which then reinforces stereotypes about communities of color in particular. And so we stopped using that term safe spaces because what's implied is that those people are unsafe. And that's not true, that we cannot make that equation for you. And we will push back on that and make you uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable. You can be uncomfortable and safe. So for example, I love high school sports. It's uncomfortable there because you're in the gym, it's hot, it's miserable, but I'm not unsafe, but I am in fact uncomfortable. I wish they had better air conditioning, right? It could be cooler in here. So we need to just even decouple the words we use to help people understand, yeah, being uncomfortable is not unsafe. And it's nothing that shouldn't be normal. Like I have all kinds of conversations that make me uncomfortable, but the reality is that's the only way to become comfortable is to stay in that space. And so typically we'll say stay in that space, and we're going to have uncomfortable conversations.
Wow, that's really interesting. Differentiate between safety and discomfort. How do you do that? I have a follow-up question. This is really interesting insight. So how do you do that? How do you foster safety rather than comfort?
Yeah, so and that's why I think it's important that the emphasis should be on, you're going to be uncomfortable. There's nothing wrong with that. And we try to have that conversation and then have just a very open conversation about what's implied if we keep using the word safe in context of people of color, right? It's reasserting that. And I think that conversation is really important. And we reassert that a lot, like repetition is equally as important in conversations. Because one of the things I also tell people is you can't fix most issues around race, LGBTQ, people with disabilities in one conversation. So the fact that most people keep pushing for this solution is why they're frustrated, because they want to be comfortable and they want to move away from it. And so that's why we say stay uncomfortable, stay in the conversation. And it's going to take more than one, because I can't make you racist in 45 minutes. So why do we think we can undo it in a 145-minute session? It's just not going to happen like that. And quite frankly, these are tightly held views. I mean, the thing is, even if you are completely racist, I can respect it in the sense of it is one of your tightly held views, just like I have tightly held views. So in the conversation, that's what we have to understand, is this may take several conversations for us to get through this. It will be uncomfortable. And we just have to say, you could be uncomfortable and still be safe. It doesn't mean you are unsafe.
Hey, can I pile on that for a second?
Please do. Yes.
So I do think one of the really important things in uncomfortable conversations is having a guy like Jason, right? I think people need to be trained because I do think that you can sometimes be incredibly well-intentioned and end up doing more harm than good. And one of the things that I think we have to do a much better job of is training leaders to understand when the conversation might become uncomfortable and what to do. Because if they're not trained to handle that, I think they sometimes can cause a lot more harm than good. And I'm always encouraging people, if ahead of time you think that the conversation is going to get kind of squishy and uncomfortable, have a trained professional with you, or at least seek some counsel first.
That's such a good point. Can I jump in here? There's a couple tips I would add. I always tell people there's actually a kind of a simple tool that I use in these conversations. And it's, remember, address and fix. can what's been said be fixed? And most of the time when someone says something that's completely homophobic or racist, you're not going to fix them in that moment. But their statements can be addressed. And so if you're the most senior person in the room and you feel like, oh, this conversation is getting really, I don't know what to do. They just said something that I think is horrifying. What you can do is just call that out. Remember, you're not going to fix that person, but it's going to be addressed for the other people in the room. Because what you don't want is people leaving saying, wow, Jason was the most senior person in the room. He's our diversity expert. Someone said something completely racist and he said nothing, right? And so I always try to remind myself, because I get uncomfortable too. Like these conversations, I'm not perfect in it either, but I always try to remind myself of that simple rule. Okay, can I really fix this in the moment, or does it need to be addressed? And then I address it in the sense of, okay, you have a right to that view, but we can't have that kind of, horrible statement or whatever. You can go down that road any way you want, but at least then it's been addressed, because 9 times out of 10, you're not going to fix that person. And then the reason the conversation spirals is because we try to fix that person, right? And they become more defensive, and we get into this conversation of trying to fix them. And it's just not going to happen in a 45-minute session or even a 2-hour session or whatever it might be.
Thank you. Well, Brian and Michael, would you like to go ahead? Have you had an uncomfortable conversation, and how did you navigate that discomfort?
Yeah, definitely. And I think Jason has given some great insights, and Lisa as well. I mean, I'll give a bit of an international view, right? I think coming from Australia over to the US 6 years ago, and I think I sat with my leadership team, and I literally had one woman on that team. And I kind of had that conversation. I said with the team, hey, does something look wrong with our leadership team here? And everyone was stunned, right? And I said, there's only one woman on this leadership team. That is a problem, right? If we're going to be successful as an IT organization. And it was almost like I'd said something really bad, right? Everyone's face was, and I said, look, I'm just stating a fact here of what is true, right? I'm not saying it's anyone's fault. I'm just saying that's the situation we're in, and we need to fix that, right? So it's interesting where I kind of felt maybe it's a bit more of a cultural norm that where I came from in Australia, discussions around race, discussions around politics and stuff like that were actually more common, where coming here was just like, oh, you don't talk about that, right? Or whatever it may be. And I completely agree with Jason that I think we've got to, really challenge that norm and have some of those, difficult conversations. And also get to the point of understanding, why does someone have that particular view? Is it because of an experience in their life, in their upbringing or whatever it may be? And it might be a terrible experience. Like Jason said, it's not going to be solved in 45 minutes, right? For them to have that sort of view. Is it a mentor or a family member or something that in that experience has had them to have that view, which, could be completely different to what yours is. So really, and I actually have it even within my family, right? I've got my parents were from Greece, immigrated to Australia. They have certain views, right, based on their upbringing and the education they had growing up. I have a very different view because of the education, the upbringing I had in Australia. But it's like Jason said, you're not going to solve it in 45 minutes. It's just continued discussions and creating more awareness, right, of things that they don't know, that might help them change their views or change their mind.
Interesting. Well, thank you for sharing that story, Michael. So I have a follow-up question for you. So let's stay with that incident. Let's say that happens again, or maybe in a different team, and people feeling uncomfortable because you pointed out there's only one woman in the team. How would you approach that conversation differently this time?
I would say different. I mean, it was the kind of the first day on the job, right? So it was one of those things where, how would I approach that differently? Maybe kind of understanding that up front and having a couple of, what are we going to do differently, right, to change that, right? Because as I was coming in, I was coming to transform the department and the team, which meant sort of turning it on its head and really looking at it from the ground up. So there's, we started, I think when I started in 2016, we had 9% of women in the IT department, right? We're up to about 28% or 29% now, right? And that's not a hockey stick move, right, in terms of, but it's moving the needle a little bit. And the point there is, these things do take time, right? Especially, where I'm in an industry where it's very hard to find sort of women talent, right? And I'm pushing our recruitment team to go, I need resumes that are women, right? Because I don't want the best person for the job. I want the best person that's going to fit in with the team to create the best team, right? So that's how I would approach it a little bit differently, rather than just, dropping that grenade in the middle of in the room. Be more, okay, this is what we're going to do about it, right? This is what some of my suggestions are, but I'm open if anyone has any other suggestions, right? Because people in the room might have just thought, well, okay, so he's going to get rid of us now and just bring women in, is he? Right? But that wasn't the intent. It was just to really shock a little bit about the challenges we have if we're going to be a successful team. We need to get more diversity in that team.
Wonderful. See if I'm understanding you correctly. You talked about one is approaching it from a systems perspective rather than just one instance, this instance where we only have one woman represented, and the other is to get other people's input in terms of how to do that.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you. Brian, do you have an experience of an uncomfortable conversation? How did you navigate it?
Yeah, we decided that we wanted to have some of these topics around racial discrimination, social justice, and framed it up in a way where we said, like Jason said, lean into being uncomfortable. But we also did something. Pfizer has done a phenomenal job and continues to do a phenomenal job about our hiring practices, diverse slate of candidates, diverse slate of interview panels, all those things. We switched it a little bit and said, we want to become better people. So this isn't about us as work colleagues. This is about us as people. And so we purposely kind of set the work setting aside and leaned into some of the some heavy topics for discussion, right? But we wanted people to feel comfortable. Now, Jason, I do have a question for you. We did use SAFE, but we did it because we wanted to create a learning environment where people felt like they could ask questions back and forth and search for understanding for something that maybe they didn't experience themselves, and do it in such a way where they didn't have to be afraid to do so, right? So that was the context, right? Now you framed it completely different, and that was not the intent of using the word. So I am kind of curious about creating an environment where, to have true understanding, true learning, true empathy, right? You want that back and forth from people. You want to ask a question like, okay, I'm not sure if I should ask this question, but I kind of want to understand, help me understand this. What does this mean to you? And I wonder what recommendations would you have to create that type of environment? Because for me, what really opened my eyes was everyone started telling personal stories, right? And so now it's not hypothetical. It's not at a societal level. It's personal stories of things that they have experienced. And it was really, really eye-opening. And I'd like to continue those conversations, because that's how I think we have more empathy for people and kind of get past some of these differences. But Jason, how would you recommend framing that, if that's the intent, right? How would you recommend creating that type of framework?
Yeah, so I think we need to obviously have inclusive conversations, and that's a simple way to frame it. We're going to have inclusive conversations,
okay.
And because there's another dynamic here that you kind of touched on, I think is very important, is that we want people to feel like they can share with whatever story they have. We realize it does make people uncomfortable. They want to be able to go somewhere they can ask tough questions. I think the other piece to think about, though, and this is why I push back on it, is the way it makes me feel as a person of color, that you have to be safe to have a conversation implies what you think about me. And to me, we also have to have that conversation, because to me, there's a subtlety here that's kind of offensive, actually. Okay. That the only way you can talk about race and your experiences is somehow it's unsafe. And are you implying that somehow I'm going to lose control of who I am because you said something that might be racist or you're not sure about? And I understand the premise, but there's a certain amount of privilege that actually comes in that framing. And of course, I'm an academic, so I love these kind of academic conversations. But that's why I push back on it. It's because we should also question that. Like, why does the only way I can have this conversation is to feel safe? Are you also making an equation about that people of color make you feel unsafe, or that people with disabilities make you feel unsafe? And I don't think safe is the word you want. I see what you're saying, and true transparency, I don't know that I have a better word. I understand the premise of safe, but it's just what's implied in this term that I think we should push back on and begin thinking about, because it does frame it, I think, in a power dynamic, actually, that makes people of color or people from underrepresented groups appear like somehow issues that impact me personally are unsafe for other people to talk about.
Thanks.
Thank you. And Lisa, would you like to add anything additional? I know you had a side conversation with Annalisa already, which is great in terms of how majority members can convey a genuine commitment to inclusion.
For me, leaders who are public learners are leaders who garner trust. I mean, if the situation is chaotic and you're the leader, it's not about being a public learner. You better actually know the answer and give the directives. But most of the time, leaders aren't in that situation. And when leaders can demonstrate that they don't have to know it all, that they're not infallible, that they themselves can ask questions, I think you create a sense of trust and a sense of community and encourage people to participate and do the same. I'm completely aligned with Jason on get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And when I spent some time at IBM, which is a very, old white male environment, we spent a lot of time working hard to make people uncomfortable. And we changed some serious minds. It takes time. It is not the 45-minute conversation. One of my fondest memories, I won't give you the whole backstory, one of my fondest memories was at the end of one 2-day seminar, we had put people together like you did in the little breakout rooms. We put people together to break the ice. And there were 2 white gay guys who didn't know each other, who just happened to end up at the same table with an older African-American gentleman at the table. The 2 gay guys had a conversation, and the African-American guy was really surprised. And my HR team said we shouldn't even be doing this, and I'm like, oh my God, here's what they told me was going to happen. It's all going to go to hell. My fondest memory is at the end of the second day, I saw the back of these 3 guys walking out of the hotel, sort of arm in arm. And they spent 2 days learning about each other as people, as humans. And when you give people the opportunity to be uncomfortable and to really be truthful about the questions they are curious about, I think it builds relationships and trust, and that's how we move the needle.
Great. Thank you for sharing that story. So we talked about this discomfort of leaning into it and keeping the conversation going, even if it's uncomfortable. What are the outcomes? What are the outcomes we expect? When we would say, well, this is a great conversation. You talked about the 3 guys walking out and arm in arm, and that is a testimony or evidence that it has been a good conversation. What else? What else can we seek for or strive for in conversations that can be uncomfortable? Go ahead, Lisa.
I think when you get participation, that is a hallmark of people feeling included. And again, I agree with Jason, when you get to the place where people are willing to dissent, then you've really created an environment where people feel like their points of view are going to be heard and they won't be punished for them. Dissent is a great barometer of the extent to which people feel like you've created an inclusive environment.
I can add real quickly. One of the things I always try to help people with is the goal should be, you don't have to be perfect, but you have to be present. And I think as a leader, we should remind ourselves, and really anybody in the room, that perfection isn't the goal when it comes around to talk about race. It's to be present. And by me being present, I mean, you have the conversation, you stay uncomfortable if it makes you uncomfortable, and you ask questions. I do think, Brian did make a good point. Like, I want people to share their authentic selves. There's things that, like, if you think about it, there's things about myself that I'm not comfortable with. If you'd have met me in my early 20s, I was completely homophobic. I'm not proud of that, but it didn't end in one day, right? The way it ends is I stayed present in the conversation. Yeah, these things make me uncomfortable. I don't know what to say. I feel horribly uncomfortable. What am I supposed to do? I grew up with all these homophobic slurs that I felt so comfortable using. It doesn't go away in the 45-minute session, but it does go away if I stay present. If I realize I'm not going to be perfect, I'm going to make mistakes, that I have to, regardless, ask questions, try to learn, stay present in the moment. And I think that's really what we ask of people is we can have a good conversation if you're present. If you work on being perfect and you're afraid to say anything, it's hard for us to work through issues. we're all going to make mistakes. Just stay in the moment and we can work through these.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, I would say in terms of when I came into the US and chaired the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Council, you can just imagine, a lot of people in that council are like, okay, here's an Australian tall white guy, running our DE&I council, right? And it wasn't until I kind of showed some vulnerability that people started opening up, right? And that vulnerability being telling my story about, my parents immigrating to Australia, me experiencing racism growing up, me being married to an Indigenous, Australian, having two girls and seeing what the challenges were in the IT industry, in particular in the early 2000s and things like that. Then people will open up. So if you show some vulnerability as well and maybe offer something up first, then that conversation could definitely become more meaningful. But to the point around outcomes, I did see when I did start, there was a lot of discussions, but not a lot of action, right? And we would spend hours having those conversations, and those conversations are really important, don't get me wrong. But I think we've also got to complement that with, okay, what are we going to do, right? What are the initiatives we're going to put together to actually change things, right? And where I was at Suez, there was some simple things that weren't in place around our recruitment practices, communication of our business resource groups. Yes, looking at some statistics. I know there was a question in the chat there. Can you measure inclusion? I said, yes, you can measure diversity. Can you measure inclusion? I think that becomes more almost like a staff sort of satisfaction survey, right? And including something in there about whether you feel included and your culture and your value sets and things like that. So I do think you can measure some of those things, but I think you need to balance both the conversations and the meaningful conversations and the vulnerable conversations and uncomfortable ones with, okay, what are the actions and outcomes you want to do and achieve?
Great, thank you. Brian, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got the outcomes like Michael mentioned in terms of goals around diversity in your leadership teams at various levels, all of those things from a corporate standpoint, I think are very measurable, very actionable, and literature shows that if you look at that, you pay attention to that, and you track your progress, right, you can absolutely make an impact on that. I think inclusion is a cultural phenomenon, right? And like politics in an organization of a certain size, I think all culture is local, right? Meaning, how does the manager and that environment articulate and implement what comes from the top down, right? And that's how it manifests, right? Culture is, Albert Bourla can talk about what culture he wants. How it manifests itself is like my boss and who I interact with, right? So are the leaders walking the talk that's happening, because that's what you need to measure. So the question about inclusion, the point that Michael made about the satisfaction survey, that type of feedback, right? Those are the types of things that you need to make sure that the local culture of the team is rolling up to the point where it is where you want it to be from an inclusion perspective. That's softer, right? That takes time. That takes management wanting to make sure that that's actually happening. And it's a combination of satisfaction surveys, annual review surveys, those type, but then skip levels, those types of things. I agree with Jason's earlier point, right? A lot of times I was in communications for a while and people would try to manufacture questions like, well, let's tee a couple things up when this leader speaks. And I'm like, no. I want to know when there's time for Q&A, if there's a 4-minute, 3-minute, which seems forever, blank period, that's a red flag, and so like letting the culture kind of manifest itself. Those are all the things that I look for in terms of inclusion from a culture perspective, and then as well as what I mentioned earlier about there are definitely measurable metrical things you can do too.
Excellent. Thank you.
Hey, Wayne,
I'd
can I
like-
make a point? Sorry.
Yes, please.
So,
Go ahead.
at the end of the day, the simplest measure of culture is what people do. Culture is what people do. And it starts at the top. And if the very top of the organization is about the lip service around inclusion and diversity, you're not going to have a culture that is inclusive. I think it's critically important, regardless of the size of the organization, that the core values around this topic are not only articulated by the leaders, they're actually lived by the leaders. And when the top of the food chain, behind closed doors, operating one way, it's open and all the people are there, that leader operates in a different way, that's a real problem. And that's when you get organizations that are dysfunctional. And the Special Olympics had a great tagline a couple of years ago. And the tagline was, "Inclusion is the revolution." And I think we spend too much time talking about diversity. I think, to Michael's point, diversity is the statistic. It's the, it's the outcome. It's the measure of whether or not you created an inclusive environment. And the inclusive environment has to start at the top. To the extent that the leaders model the behavior truly, then you're more likely to have an inclusive environment.
Excellent. Thank you for the addition, Lisa. And talking about Olympics, Jason, do you have anything? I know you work on the Olympic committee, the previous one. So in that kind of context, what does inclusion look like in that kind of context?
Yeah. So the U.S. Olympic team is unique, and I have to share some of this, and I apologize, it might be a little laborious, but if you're a sports fan, it's probably more fun for you. But every sport in the U.S. is a nonprofit that participates in the Olympic Games, and the U.S. Olympic team is also a nonprofit. So when I was there doing diversity, the question became, well, how are we going to measure this thing? How do we know racquetball is diverse versus volleyball? And so I was able to identify some metrics and come up with a scorecard that we could use to measure the sports against each other in such a way that validated their differences without exacerbating those who had more resource. So for instance, USA basketball is loaded. I mean, they have tons of casts versus team handball, which had one person. But we were able to identify, what's your pipeline look like? And does the pipeline look like the leadership team? And if it does, so a good example is actually USA volleyball. At that time, when we did one of the first measures, women make up 80% of those athletes who play volleyball in the US. Yet at that time, basically the number one, number two women's team in the world, Team USA, didn't have a woman coaching. Like, that's mathematically impossible. And so just by pointing that out, it helps them identify what's a good use of our time. Like, maybe we should look at some gender diversity within our coaching staff. Like, this kind of outcome has to be intentional. And, they had like 5 or 6 coaches and a trainer, not one woman. Like, that outcome, there's no way. And so that's part of what I was able to do there, is just identify what are those data points. I've been able to further that is to measure inclusion. There's actually a few things that I've also identified that I kind of suggest. One is turnover. That's an indicator of something's going on. If women turn over at a high rate, there's a data point telling you something about your inclusion, right? Or if people of color are leaving at a high rate compared to their white peers, it tells us something. And then I have a small startup, Cape Inclusion, and we actually came up with an inclusion measure, because what we realized is there are certain behaviors we see in a meeting that typically make people want to leave. I show up, people talk over the top of me. They don't let me finish my sentences, right? They take my ideas. And the data shows that people of color and women are disproportionately targeted when that happens. Don't get to finish your sentences. And so we came up with a way to measure that in meetings. We thought, what? A lot of times people realize, well, my environment's not inclusive, but I don't know what to do. And if I said, well, when you go to a meeting, stop talking over women when they speak up, stop taking their ideas, allow them to finish their sentences. That's concrete. Okay, now I know what to do. How do we know if a person's doing it? We just came up with a simple way to start measuring that and tracking it so that we could change behaviors. And because what I find sometimes is people don't know what they're doing. That's what we call it, unconscious. So if you can just bring that to their consciousness, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means, whoa, if I'd known I was doing it, I'm happy to change it. I didn't know I was doing this, right? That's how I stay present, right? Just in the moment. And so there are some things we can do to measure inclusion that are simple tools to track behaviors in meetings and things like that. So just simple plug for Cape Inclusion, but you can just go to capeinclusion.com and you can see the inclusion tracker there. And we actually have a free version that people can use. I just think it's important for people to understand what behaviors, because inclusion is hard, right? Because I don't know what behaviors I'm doing, but just by a simple way of identifying it, you can change behavior, you can track it. And people then know that you mean that this is real. These are things I'm being held accountable to.
Coaching in the moment is really important, right? I use the simple example with my husband, right? If I had lipstick on my teeth, wouldn't you tell me? wouldn't you want me to know that something wasn't right? And if you hit the dog, sorry for the analogy, if you hit the dog 3 days after it pees on the carpet, it's confused. And I think when you have the opportunity to coach in the moment, it doesn't need to be aggressive coaching. You can say, hey, I'm not sure that that person received that the way you intended it. It didn't really feel very good to me. If you coach people, you at least give them the opportunity to remediate their behavior and to become cognizant of it. If you don't coach in the moment, I think that's a mistake.
Could I add to that real quick? It's because
Please do.
I noticed there's a question about trust. Like, what do you do when trust is broken and how do you rebuild it? And Lisa's making a good point about you have to coach in the moment. So if I hear silence all the time, right? I ask something, there's silence. If someone ever does speak up, you have to validate that in that moment right then, right? Because then I start sending them, because what I can do is, we disagree. Thank you for bringing that up. Because then what I start doing is modeling the behavior that I want. And so as a leaders, that's what you really have to do is coach in that moment. The minute someone does have the courage to speak up, you have to validate it. And when I say validate, it doesn't mean you agree with it. People confuse those two terms. Like someone could say something and I could totally disagree with it, but I can make sure everyone knows that I hear it and that it's important. And by doing that, I can start building trust. Because if I say, I want to hear your opinion, and then the minute you say it, I start tearing it apart, I've broken trust, right? You say you want my opinion, I give it to you, and all you do is, verbally abuse me. I've learned the lesson not to speak up. But if the first response is validating, wow, thanks for bringing that up. That's a real good point. Hadn't thought of that. Now, I haven't once said I agreed with it, right? All I did was validate it to build trust because I want people to continue that behavior. So that's one way to rebuild that trust is you have to validate the fact that it's important for you to speak up.
Excellent point. Anything else other panelists would like to add? Good. Okay, so let's just move on just a little bit, but stay with the conversation about discomfort or skepticism. So sometimes we face audiences who are skeptical. Maybe they have experienced some diversity efforts in the past, which failed or didn't lead anywhere or become just paying lip service. So if we are faced with a skeptical audience, how would you jumpstart conversations, maybe in a different way about diversity and inclusion? Have you had an experience of trying to persuade a skeptical audience in terms of doing that? Or maybe even not skeptical, but maybe nonchalant, people who don't care, saying nothing's broken, why do you want to fix it?
There's some data that shows the average diversity officer lasts about 16 months. And this is why people become skeptical. You're there for a year and a half. What's going on? The place looks the same. And I think one of the challenges is you have to set realistic expectations. For example, there's some dynamics that really set you up to fail. One being, if you're committed to diversity, wouldn't the leadership team be more diverse? Right? Makes sense. It's mathematically impossible to do that in 1 year. Why? Because it's hard to get a VP job. It's hard to get the COO job. And so once you get it, you don't leave quickly. And if they did leave quickly, that's indicative of a company that's failing. High turnover at your leadership team is indicative of a company that's failing. All right, plain and simple. So if you have good retention, which is what you're supposed to have, the CEO's task, keep good leaders. If they're really good at keeping good leaders and they're not diverse, it ain't gonna look different in 16 months. But everyone's looking at you as a diversity officer as, well, here we go, no commitment here. And so it's important to set realistic expectations of what can actually be achieved. Help people understand why we have these conversations. Because I think a good point is, well, we've had a lot of conversations, but nothing's changed. And part of it is, no, actually the fact we're having these conversations is change, because we couldn't even have these conversations. I was in a company recently, very religious based, and they were very uncomfortable around LGBTQ, all right? But within the first year or so, we were able to add pronouns to titles and things like that. And those are indicative of a culture that is changing. Sure, they're simple, but that's how cultures change. And they change through repetition. Yeah, we're going to keep having this conversation because we're going to move the organization. And so you have to have realistic expectations. And a lot of that skepticism is because their assumption of what you can do is well beyond what can be done in the time period that you've been tasked with. Like high turnover on a leadership team is not a good thing. I can't make it more diverse in 16 months. Just not going to happen. So you have to always remind people what we've been able to achieve, where we are in this process, and realize, because like I said, I can't undo racism in 45 minutes. So you can't assume the company's going to turn, in 45 minutes. It's just not going to happen. But if we set a realistic expectation and build the conversation around organizational change, people then can understand, okay, this is how we're going to direct the organization. It'll take a little while. And these are some markers along the way. The conversations are actually one of the markers along the way. The repetition of these conversations is a marker. And this was a good point that was made by Michael, and that was, how have we changed our hiring practices? Because I might not be able to quickly change the leadership team, but I could at least point to, but we've changed how we recruit people of color and how we recruit women. And we've done things to make sure if an opportunity presents itself, we can activate in that moment. So we are thinking about it, and we are anticipating what we could do in the future. And those are the things you have to do to signal that you can make change, and you can validate the fact that I can understand the skepticism, but these are the things we put in place.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I completely agree with what Jason's saying, that sometimes we focus a lot on the diversity metrics, right? And like Jason said, they're not going to change drastically, you know, over a 1 year period or whatever it may be. And as I mentioned, I mean, my team was 9% women when I started. It's now 29, but that's over a 4 year period, and the team's probably doubled in size, right? So you need to get out of the mindset of these numbers are going to change really quickly, right? And really focus on, okay, having those challenging conversations, right? And people feeling that they can open up. I'm a big believer in terms of authentic leadership. So, you know, walking the talk, right? And showing as a leader that you believe in what you're saying and you follow those practices, whether it's me, you know, we have kind of our leadership team decide in terms of recruitment, in particular for senior roles, and me sort of being in that meeting and saying, hey, we've seen 10 resumes and not one woman, right? And maybe the recruitment team go, oh, but it's cybersecurity, it's very difficult. I said, we've got to try harder, right? We're just got to try and, you know, go and find them on LinkedIn and just try and approach them or whatever. Maybe we just need to try harder. It's not going to happen by itself. We've actually got to change our practices and push ourselves into those uncomfortable areas to try and, you know, make progress in this space. So I completely agree with what Jason's saying, that, you know, it's very difficult coming in and being a chief diversity officer or something like that, and having maybe a CEO saying, okay, I want to see these supply diversity numbers change in a year, right? I mean, it's an evolution, and it takes time to get there.
I think the incremental progress and the incremental commitments are really important. To the extent the organization articulates the milestones or the waypoints out loud, publicly, not just in the leadership team room, they are more likely to hold themselves accountable. And I think recruiting is a great area. One of the things that we did, that I did at IBM, was as the managers wanted to hire, I refused to validate their hiring, their requisition, unless they presented a diverse slate of candidates. You know, they all complain that, geez, it's going to take a lot longer. Not my problem, right? Go figure out how to get it done. And it really did change the hiring practices. And you can point to that. You can say, hey, here's what we've said to the organization. We're not going to entertain hiring somebody unless there's a diverse slate of candidates. So don't bother bringing a slate unless it's diverse. And you can demonstrate those progress points. It's not going to be turning over the leadership team in 16 months, but there are progress points that you can articulate and demonstrate.
Ryan, would you like to talk?
Yeah, I mean,
share your perspective?
Just to build on what Lisa's talking about, you know, I think there's almost a social compact between leadership and employees about how we're going to move this forward. You know, and I think what Jason said about address and fix at an individual meeting level is also something that you could probably apply at a corporate level. I mean, we're going to address these, and we're going to have conversations, and that is part of this, but we'll be transparent about our what our short, medium, and long-term goals are, share them with you, and hold us accountable. If we're not making progress, we're in this together. That's part of the social compact. So I think part of this is storytelling around your plan to bring people along with you to make sure that the way progress is measured is something that is uniformly accepted. And then it's vulnerability. Like, this is what we're going to do. Hold us accountable. If we don't do it, you know, come back at us, right? That's how that needs to work to show progress. But I mean, Jason's point about the diversity officers having very short, you know, tenures, I think that has to do with expectation, storytelling, and how do you take people along on a journey. If the organization has these challenges for years, it doesn't get fixed in that amount of time. But that's the social compact that you have to have with your organization to explain how you're going to walk them through the journey.
I'd like to have a follow-up question on this in terms of storytelling, which is a great way of framing how we can move the needle forward. But when we're faced with a skeptical audience, how much do you use the business case of diversity? Well, having more women, maybe in the IT space, can help us do this. Or do you tell other stories? What are all the multitude of stories you can tell to address concerns of skeptical audiences who may be saying, well, everything's going fine. Why do we need to change? What's the reasons for change? So what's your experience like in terms of motivating people who are not motivated to go more toward elevating diversity and inclusion?
I'll just say a couple of things. It's ands, right? So it's the business case, but I have found the most powerful examples have been the personal ones, right? So when I've had people on my team talk about what it was like growing up as a Muslim in New York after 9/11, right? The microaggressions African American women had to deal with on a regular basis. When they start, a colleague from Italy that came over that was yelled at about his accent on the streets, right? Like these types of things, right? Now, this isn't academic anymore. Like, no, this is happening to people that that you care about, that are high performing colleagues, but also our people, right? It really changed it from a hypothetical societal conversation to no, this happened to me now. Do you think that's right? And I found those very powerful anecdotes to be just as important as kind of the overall literature around the business case and making it very personal.
Yeah, I add to what Brian's saying. I think making it personal is probably the most powerful aspect to it. I mean, whether we celebrate, I know in California we have a great woman who's an operator there running one of the biggest plants, right? And we're always celebrating what she has done there in terms of challenging the norms in terms of the water industry, which tends to be more male dominated, especially running plants and distribution networks, and being so successful at running one of the biggest plants, right, in the country. So I think it's really communicating and celebrating those successes where you have people of diverse backgrounds really pushing the business forward and growing the business.
The only thing I would add is I would say over the last year, it's been less of an issue to try to convince people diversity and inclusion is important. I have found that most people, that isn't a major piece of the conversation. And it's sad, but true. I mean, the thing is that it's sad it had to come to that point, but there is a story that's driving this. And I think we all saw this, how ugly George Floyd, the way he passed, the way he was murdered, and the conversation's moved. I think most people want to see change. And so I guess if anything good came out of that, I'm telling you, the conversation now is a lot easier than it was a year ago before George Floyd was murdered.
I still think the business imperative, not enough people understand. I think people now really get, to your point, Jason, they really get the societal imperative. I'm still not sure in certain business settings that people actually truly understand the business imperative of having a diverse organization, right? We know what the statistics are with respect to boards that are in the top quartile of diversity and leadership teams that are in the top quartile of diversity. They are 40% more likely to be above average profitability. So I think it was Brian that said it. It's definitely an and thing. I think we do need to tell the business imperative, and we need to tell the personal stories as well. And I encourage leaders who think they can tell their own story in 2 minutes don't actually probably know their own story. And one of the things I find really helpful with leadership development is helping leaders construct their journey line, as we used to call it in the old days, to truly understand their own story, how they became who they are, and what are the things that influence and impact them. I think in order to be able to tell a story, you actually have to know your own story. And I do think we still need to do a better job about the business imperative of being an inclusive organization.
Thank you. Thank you all. Let me shift just a little bit to talk about more micro practices. So we talked about having conversations about diversity and developing measures and that sort of thing. What are some other specific, let's change the question. So let's say you are practicing inclusive practices in your daily business, workplace lives. What are some other things you do that demonstrates that you're being inclusive of others? In addition to having conversations, what else do you do?
I mean, for me, it's continually repeating I want to hear from everybody that what are your thoughts on the topic? That a B plan with 100% buy-in is going to be much more effective than an A plan that no one really supports, right? And so just trying to acknowledge that type of discretionary effort is really important to business success, and creating an environment where people feel like they can, as Jay said, dissent, right? Come up with creative ideas, that we brainstorm, that we don't we greenhouse them, right? We don't run them over, and just, I as a leader always, kind of ask myself, okay, have I heard from everyone? And I think the one thing that point of information, when I was with Pfizer, I was going through this program, and they had a personality trait of everyone that went through this leadership program, and it was like 85% type A's, right? Like, so like there's a type, right? And so you need to ask yourselves, okay, what about the introverts? What about the folks that aren't the type A's, that are extraordinarily smart, talented? Are you getting the best out of them? And so, I try to put in practice just continually acknowledging, people that have not spoke, ask them if they felt that, and trying to create a point where it's absolutely encouraged, not only okay, but encouraged for there to be a disagreement. It's a sign of a healthy team, and that type of is how we're going to get to the right answer. As long as you can create a situation where people feel like they're on the same team, you can disagree while still, as Jay said, not being disagreeable, but you're still on a team, right? So you're still helping us towards the goal, right? And so I try to do that on a regular basis with my team, and then encourage my managers, hey, how are the people that maybe aren't the first to speak, right? Are they bought in? Right? What's your engagement from them, right? And those are all important factors in terms of inclusion for me.
Thank you. Any additional insights?
Yeah, I would just go back to what we mentioned earlier, which is celebrate differences, right? And not be silent about it, and actually amplify. It might be an example where in my team, we sent 3 women on, IT leadership training specific for women in IT, right? And they've got women CIOs that are mentors and stuff like that, right? And I'm vocal about that, right? Because I want to try and develop the next generation of leaders in IT that are women, right? Because there's obviously a gender imbalance, right? And we know diversity is not just gender, but I think in the IT arena, that is one of the big challenges that we need to try and solve. Whether it's celebrating, different diversity days for different cultures, whether it's Diwali, whether it's Easter, whether it's Hanukkah, whatever it may be, and being vocal about that, because there is, especially my team, there's people from all around the world that are working in the team, and it's good for others to understand what those different cultures are, and what people celebrate and why they celebrate it. So I think that really, and it goes to the point we said earlier, which is, about walking the talk, right? In terms of, showing that's, you want to learn more, you want to have that growth mindset. For me as a leader, to learn about all these different cultures and different beliefs and values, and not just be, sort of have the blinkers on in terms of just what my upbringing has been, what I've experienced. I mean, I think I've educated 100 people in my team about, about Australia and the culture of Australia, right? There's a certain preconceived idea about great white sharks and crocodiles and things that will kill you there. And it's like, well, actually, no, Australia's very different to that, right? And this is the culture, right? And it's very rare to see to go to the beach and there be a shark there or whatever it may be. It's some of those, just bringing some of those kind of whatever people have read in the press or on social media and stuff, and really kind of validating, actually, no, this is what it is from a cultural point of view.
Thank you. Jason and Lisa, do you have anything to add?
Just real quick, Brian kind of touched on this, but I think there's something to be said to look at the systemic things that are put in place. Often in hiring, one of the things I often see is people focus on, have you done it before? And if you're in an industry where women and people of color are underrepresented, they probably haven't done it before. So you need to hire on potential. But systemically, we put in this criteria in our job descriptions that say 4 years experience of this or 4 years of that. And if you haven't done that exact thing, we won't consider you, which systemically removes people of color and women. Because if you're underrepresented in engineering, rarely would you have that skill set. But the question should be, can you do it if given the opportunity? And we need to begin looking systemically, like we've created these barriers unnecessarily, that many times people have the potential. They don't have the experience, but the only way to get it is for you to hire them. But if the dynamics always, oh, you have to have 4 years of experience, you've just systematically removed people and basically reproduced the bias that already exists in the system. So we do really need to look at how we hire people, what the criteria is, and we can still get great candidates. It doesn't mean we don't get good candidates. It means that we just look at the system and is it creating and reproducing this disparity that already exists.
Anything else? Well, then let's move on to the next question, which is, I think a lot of people probably are interested. How did you learn your diversity and inclusion practice? Where did you learn it? Any particular turning points or important events or periods of time that you did a lot of intense learning on this front?
I think a lot of it is experience. Well, it's the combination. For me, it's a combination of experience, both good and bad. And we tend to learn a lot more from bad experiences. I think I love to study failure and why things fail. My, experience as a woman in IT 40 years ago, I started when I was 12. So, you can't really tell my age. It was a terrible time to grow up as a female in that industry. And, I lucked out and had a couple of really good mentors and coaches. And I had a couple of really crappy ones, and I learned equally from both of them. I think so. I was at an event, and many of you may know this story, with Condoleezza Rice. So she went to the University of Colorado, and she went to Colorado to study classical piano. And that was what she was going to do. And she met a professor. And as a result of the interaction that she had with the professor said to her, geez, you might consider diplomacy as a career or a calling. And sort of the rest is history. Well, the reason she tells the story is because the professor was a short, white Jewish guy. And her message to the audience is, you can't always look for role models that look like you. You need to seek out a bunch of role models. Some of them will be great and some of them won't. And I think that's a really important point. We won't look up. Even today, women won't look up. People of color won't look up and see a leadership team or even enough leaders that look like them. And it's important to not turn down coaching and mentoring from people who don't just look like you. You'll be some good experience and some bad. And, a lot of what I've learned was through experience. And there's no substitute for actually learning and reading and talking. There's real work to be done to develop yourself as an inclusive leader.
Thank you.
I mean, for me, when I've been with Pfizer for about 16 years. I had many female bosses. The diversity in so I when I was brought it never really kind of entered my mind when I came into the corporate world, right? I was kind of, and then as I moved over into recent jobs, people of color, women hires, like the diversity of the group was pretty good. It's something we, completely bought into the business case about it, right? So it was more like, how are we on track? Yes, we are. We're doing well there. We continue to do well. Diverse candidates, diverse interview panels, those types of things. What really struck me was with the George Floyd murder, and we were having these I mentioned this earlier. We're having these conversations because everyone's remote, right? We're remote. People don't know what's happening with the pandemic, and just we were on a call and just touch base call. How's everybody doing? And you could just, people were really down, And so started having some one-off conversations with folks. Hey, how are you feeling about this? And it became very clear there was a real need to have a conversation, right? And an outlet to talk about it. So we've done that. And I think, to me, I'm not trying to toot my own horn. It was just very eye-opening to me, all of my professional colleagues dealing with all of this personal angst and issues that I never have had to deal with, right? And I knew some of it was there. I naively thought, well, it's 2020, right? We've moved past this in a lot of cases, and nope, we haven't. And just had another conversation with a female colleague 2 days ago about some of the feedback she got about her career and how she needed to change her appearance. And I was just angry because, but it's been very, so that's where I want to continue my personal journey, which is creating environments where people feel like they can bring this stuff up, but where it gets eradicated, because it has no place. It has no place, right? But it continues to be there.
Yeah, I'll add to what Lisa was saying. For me, it's a lot around experience, right? Having, starting off my career in IT and having, my first boss was a woman, and just seeing how challenging it was for her. And she was fantastic, right? She was confident, she knew her stuff really well, very intelligent, but she had to fight so much harder than the guys to get her outcomes and her initiatives done and stuff like that. So that's sort of where it started for me. And then, I've had I've been fortunate enough to be able to travel the world and work in different countries, whether it was in Hong Kong, here in the US, in Europe. I've worked for a period of time as well. And just seeing those differences in terms of culture and backgrounds and beliefs and stuff like that has just helped me grow. But also, from the mistakes I've made, right? And those that have been courageous enough to call me out on them, right? And speak up about it. So for me, it's very much around experience, and also I have a bit of a growth mindset, so I'm always reading and learning new things and things like that. But that would be my my take on where I've learned to make this a priority and how important it is for me.
Thank you, Jason. How about you?
I'm unusual in that I've done diversity almost my entire career, which is almost 30 years now. I flunked out of college, actually. I'm dyslexic. I didn't know. So I was a terrible student. And so it was actually the director of diversity at the time, pulled me under her wing and said, I think you have some potential. You should be graduating. And she gave me a job, which I desperately needed, and helped me to graduate and kind of launch my career in diversity. But one of the most poignant moments actually is something I learned from her daughter. Her daughter was in high school, I think. And so she would hang around the diversity officer at the university, at the diversity office there. And I remember one day they had this publication where students could submit their poetry and, prose, whatever it was, And so I'm reading it, I'm making fun of it. This poetry's terrible. I'm reading it out loud to her, making fun of it. And finally, she just looked at me and said, Jason, would you want the only view of the world and the only interpretation of poetry to be yours? And I thought, no, I wouldn't. This is horrifying what I'm saying out loud. Like in that moment, it just helped me to have kind of this growth mindset, which was just mentioned, like to realize, wow, that would be terrible. Like me making fun of this poetry says something about me that I didn't like. Like that was just so close-minded and so sure that I somehow could make or give an opinion about poetry and someone else's art. That really art is about appreciating it. And it should be different. There should be different views. It shouldn't just be what I like and not like. And it was so helpful to me. And it's funny that I remember that because Dolores, who was my mentor, was so good to me my entire career. It's helped me in so many ways. But that is one of the moments that I remember the most, that me being challenged in that simple way of thinking about the world, and like this myopic view I had that somehow I should be able to choose good poetry and bad poetry. And I was actually quite embarrassed by that. And she was actually in high school at the time pointing this out to me. And so it was very helpful. And I always remind myself of that sometimes when I disagree with things, or I found myself in a moment think, you know what, there are other views of the world that are equally as valid as my own. And it was a good thing to actually happen to me early in my life. And it's always helped me sometimes to pause for a minute and go, okay, there are other views. There are things that I can disagree with, but I shouldn't have the only view. And I wouldn't want to live in a world where one person could dictate the only view of the world. So
it's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that. Do we have any questions from the audience? I know some of the questions you put into chat and have already been addressed to a large extent. Any other questions from the audience? Well, if not, I'd like to ask the last question then, which is, well, looking forward, so giving COVID and giving all kinds of social movements and changes, what would be your prediction of what's going to happen or trends you hope would happen related to diversity and inclusion?
So I've got one, and I put it in the chat. When the Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer, and frankly, I hope we drop the diversity part because it is just the statistic. When the Chief Inclusion Officer or Equity and Inclusion Officer is a direct report to the CEO, to me, that's real progress. Too many times I see it as a bolt-on to HR because it's a people thing. It's an HR thing, and it's not. It's a business imperative. That to me would be, at least in the corporate world, that would be a demonstration of some real progress. When the officer is a direct report to the CEO, provided the CEO's articulating the proper set of values, that to me is real progress at the corporate level.
Thank you.
I completely agree with Lisa on that. I was the first kind of chair of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Council that wasn't in HR. And then now it's gone back in there, and I agree. It's sort of stereotyped that it's people, so it's HR, right? But it's much more than that. And I think it needs to come out from under that umbrella and be its own kind of capability within a business, right? And that shows the sponsorship and ownership from a CEO level as well.
I'm going to take a little different perspective. I think you're going to continue to see companies and corporations take positions on these types of issues, right? Coming out forcibly against these types of actions, making statements not just focused on business operations, but an agent of change for good in this space more vocally than they have in the previous 10 years. I think you saw that a little bit more in the last, I'd say, 2 years. I think that's going to continue to accelerate. The expectations amongst their shareholders and amongst employees is that we're not some sort of neutral, both sides-ism corporation, but we're going to take stances because we think it's the right thing to do. And I think that trend's going to accelerate.
I would only add to both those. As a chief diversity officer who's had to report to HR, not a great place. Not that I've had good leaders, people that I reported to, but yeah, even for the day-to-day, it makes it harder to do your job, and even resources, because you're also now competing within HR for staff and people, and then that conversations is filtered through the head of HR. And so they typically make that priority. So it does make it hard to execute on a daily basis. As far as the future, what I'd like to see is to kind of Brian's statement about companies make statements, and I would like to also see them being held accountable to that. So a year from now, we go, hey, that's great, you made that statement, where's the proof? Like, it would be great to see some more diversity on your board. It'd be great to see that, when you're spending with, minority-owned companies, that the commitment is to the community, that you're active in the community. So I'm hoping that that's also what we see, because I would agree with Brian, like, you can't be neutral. There's just some serious issues that we have to step up and take positions and then hold ourselves accountable. So I'm hoping what we see in the future is, okay, great, you made this wonderful statement. Show us the proof. And I'm hoping that's what we see in the next step.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so very much for all of our panelists. Thank you for the time and such rich conversation. I really appreciate it. And for those of you in the audience, we do have another. So this is one of the panel series. For some reason, I can't, my Zoom is not working, but we have another one in about 2 weeks' time to focus on developing inclusive relationships with diverse others. So talking about reaching across cultural, racial, and also religious and all kinds of boundaries to build relationships. So we'll continue this conversation, and thank you so much again for the panelists and for all the participants. And I hope our conversation continues, our actions continues when we get out of this call as well. Thanks again. I will hope to see you soon.